All right, guys, this week we went over services, and I have Maximilian's working app with the services implemented, and I am going to go over at least the recipe service. So, what we have in our recipe service file is we have a recipe selected event emitter, okay, and then we have a array of recipes, okay. We're also injecting the shopping list service into this service, which is interesting. And we have two methods. We have a get recipe method that returns the recipes, and we have an add ingredients to shopping list that takes a list of ingredients, one or more ingredients, and adds that to the list that we have on our services side. So if I go over to the services one real quick to look at that. All right, so let me see if I can get. Here it is. So on our shopping list service, what we can see is likewise it has an event manager called ingredients changed, and then it has a ingredients list. Okay, so this is the list that's getting updated from that method. Um, and then there's these other methods within the service. So, keep doing the wrong thing. Right. So if we go back to our recipe service, right, and actually let's go to the top and check out our recipe components. So in our recipe components file, right, we are having a, a property called selected recipe, right? It's a recipe. And we're also injecting a recipe service in here, okay? And we're using that event emitter right here inside recipe service. This is the point of injecting recipe services, is that we are accessing that event emitter, okay, that is going to pass through a recipe to recipe selected, okay. Let's take a look at the list component. So actually, let's look at where this is coming from. So this recipe that once we click, okay, on this tasty schnitzel, right, we are getting this selected recipe. So if we look at recipe item, let's look at recipe item. Okay, so recipe item, if we're looking at this, it has recipe property, okay, and it's coming from an input. And the way it's getting inputted is from our recipe list component, okay? So our recipe list component um, has a property called recipes. It's a list of recipes, and it is injecting the recipe services, and it's setting the recipe list in this component to be to get the recipes from recipe service. Okay, and so our item is getting that recipe from the list, which is getting that from the recipe service. Okay. However, it also is having the recipe service injected into it. Okay. And that is so that it can access the event emitter and emit the recipe when it's selected. So when you click on this big fat burger, okay, that is sending that information over to the service. Okay, it's sending that recipe over to the service. So if we go back to recipe service, right, that is getting emitted there. Okay, and that is where it is from the item. Okay, that's where that recipe comes in, and we can set this recipe to equal that recipe. Now, if you look inside the HTML here, okay, this, we have an ng if, right? So at the start, the selected recipe is just null because there hasn't been any clicks. So when we just reload our page, okay, we get please select a recipe. Um, and so then the recipe that is getting passed down into the detail, right? So the detail, if we look at that, our recipe detail, okay, has an input as well. It's a property recipe with an input as well. And so that input is coming from our, oops, I passed it. Right, so this is the recipe detail. That is being passed right here. That's where it's getting that input. Okay, so the recipe inside of recipe detail is getting the selected recipe. So that's how everything's being passed around. The information's being moved around in this. And so if we look at, go back to recipe detail right here, okay, it's getting that recipe from its parent, okay, the recipe component, and it also is injecting the recipe services. The reason it's doing that is so it can add ingredients to the shopping list. Okay, so it's accessing that method inside the recipe services, right? And it's taking the recipe, the ingredients that are in the recipe, and passing that information. Okay, and so when we click on Big Fat Burger and then go to Manage Recipe and click to Shopping List, right? That's going to add. Right. So for right now, we don't only have apples and tomatoes, but if we click on Manage Recipe, it's going to add buns and meat. Right? 2 buns and meat. And we see that. Okay. So that's what I wanted to go over in this video and practice explaining myself how the information is being moved around, how services is working. If I said anything that was incorrect, feel free to correct me and comment. Let me know if this helped you put the pieces together. And hope you guys have a great rest of the week. We'll see you again next week.